So SQL triggers. SQL triggers are actions that occur when an event happens inside of a database. So an example of this is, say, you just inserted a new row inside of a database, so you might want to get the timestamp posted in. Or you just updated an existing row, so you might want to update a timestamp or get a hash row or hash set when something happens. The point of a SQL trigger is that something happened and you want something else to happen in correlation with this event. And that's what I want to show you here today. So there's going to be a link in the description if you want to follow along. So you'll be able to set up a users table, which is actually the same one I used a few weeks ago. So you can try to follow along with the SQL Triggers example. Anyway, let's get started. So first, I'm actually going to start with this users table. And basically, you can see I have some user data inside of here. That's basically, it has some general information: first name, last name, email, password hash, created on, last updated on. But something that I want to do for this trigger is I just want to include a flag that basically says it's updated, just so I know, hey, was this recently updated, yes or no? And all I want that flag to do is just to mark true if it is, and that's it. And that's going to be triggered by the trigger. The other nice thing about triggers that I actually didn't mention earlier is that a lot of these methods that I'm actually using is going through a stored procedure right now. If I, for some reason, did not use that stored procedure and I just did a straight update statement, then the trigger is tied straight to the table. So in which case you will always see, it'll always trigger it basically, regardless if it's gone through a stored procedure or if it's gone through the trigger. It'll always be marked on there. Anyway, let's do this. Alter table users add is updated bit. Command successful. And then when I do select star from users, you can see this new column was just added. And if I hit F5 on the columns, I can see that new mark is there. If I go to triggers, there is nothing there as well. Now, I actually already pre-wrote this. And you can see I have a trigger on here for my database table users. And let's go over what it exactly does. It says create trigger user updated. That's going to be the name of the trigger on users. So that's the table. I want it to happen after an update. So it's only going to be triggered after an update actually happens. And here is the statement that I want it to do. I want to first declare a user ID, and I want to get the user ID from the trigger. So the trigger has kind of like its own little table called inserted, and it's tied in with INS. And INS will have the user ID that I actually want to use for this update. Then what I wanted to do is I wanted to do an update statement using that user ID that's going to update my row, and going back into a table, it's actually going to mark this as true. So once that gets marked, then I can actually see that, like, okay, this is the table that was just updated. Now, let's execute this. I want to switch back. Let me do F5 here on the users table, go to triggers, and I can see my triggers actually right here and added. So now, if I were to write an update statement, all right, so here's what I want to do. I want to do u.userid equals 3. And I want to update, say, first name equals, I can see here on the user's name, his name is actually John. And I've actually done an update on here before. So I'm going to do u.firstname equals, let's do Jonathan. Let's just do the full name of Jonathan. So what should happen is that once this row gets updated, I'm going to have a new mark that's on here. You can see right here inside of my statement, I don't have any is updated field marked at all. So when I run this, it says 2 rows because I updated once, the trigger updated the second time. I'm going to do select star, and you can see this was actually triggered. Now the whole reason it was triggered is because of the update statement. Now inside this table, if I were to do something a little bit different, let's do an insert statement onto this table, then we can actually see what is actually happening. Okay, so if I were to do an insert statement on the users table and to do select star, you can see down here that I have sam.sam, but because the rest of this I didn't insert it, I left it null. It didn't trigger this one because it's not updated, it's an inserted new record. So in which case it gives me some information based on this. Some good examples where you can use this would be, say, audit tables. If whenever you want an action to happen, insert, update, or delete, you want to know that, like, hey, an action just happened, I want to retain this data elsewhere. But in which case I would actually probably use merge statements for that. Now, an important thing to note about SQL triggers is that some kind of like moral uses of it. From my experience, they're actually not that common. So if you're going to use a SQL trigger, I recommend, checking in with your team that they actually know what they are and that they actually do use them. The reason I mention this is because it's one of those things that if you aren't that familiar with it, it kind of can throw some people in for a loop. In which case, if you have, say, like good rules, for instance, say you always use stored procedures when you interact with the database or some kind of rules, I recommend sticking with that instead of using SQL triggers for that reason. But otherwise, if you absolutely need it, this will hopefully be able to show you guys how it's used and in certain places where you could use them, or some examples where you could use them. So I also wanted to talk about one example that where I've used SQL triggers where they're actually kind of relatively useful, was where a place where we didn't have that many rules set for the database, and something that we needed to do was set delta records. So a delta record means that we have one record and we have an updated record, and we need to record when changes actually happen. Meaning, hey, is this brand new? Has this been updated? And that generated a hash set. We used the trigger to generate a hash set, and this then let us tell if changes actually happened, and then we were able to just continuously update only the updated records. And that was actually very useful for us, and we were able to do that with SQL triggers. I'm not saying that was the only way to do it, but it was something that actually helped us out a lot. But the other thing to note is that it can give you a bit of a hit when you do SQL triggers instead of doing other means. So for instance, if you're doing batch inserts or batch updates, it might hinder you a little bit instead of actually helping you that much, in which case, see if this is really the right option for you or if there's other alternatives to do it. Yeah, anyways, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. If you like the content, please hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Laters.